How to build a chess training program. I will assume that you know all the rules of chess as well as how to read algebraic notation. What's the objective? Fix your weakness. This is the training program in short. It's just about fixing your weaknesses. Focus solely on your biggest weakness until you can turn it into one of your biggest strengths. What does this mean? So, if you have weakness like tactics and strength like strategy, then you want to focus only on tactics until you absolutely have it on par with strategy. This means that the ideal training program may be a little bit sporadic. It can and it will change from time to time. I will list a lot of examples of weaknesses, weaknesses kind of in a more broad sense. Fundamentals like stuff that beginners should know. Attacking, defense, maybe intuition, actually definitely intuition, probably one of the more important topics. Calculation, tactical vision, like difference between calculation and tactical vision is like tactics are more short term and calculation is about trying to really look deep and come up with a judgment. Also stuff like systematic thinking or theory or strategy, maybe openings, endgames, maybe even psychology or time trouble. I do not like to discuss psychology in general because many content creators have already turned it into somewhat of a big fad gimmick. For example, Igor Smirnov, Remote Chess Academy. I think most of his lectures are pretty superficial. Same with Jacob Agard. I think a lot of these guys, maybe they have some useful examples, but honestly, I find them to be very superficial. About weaknesses, well, these are more broad, but they can be broad or specific topics. For example, like strategy is a broad topic, but uh, you can be more specific than that. You can talk about like the Karo-Slav pawn structure, like with c6 and d5 pawn structure, or like something like king safety. These are both more specific examples of strategy that could be your weakness. For me personally, I found that my biggest weakness is pawn play in a general sense. Like any position, I just don't know, like, uh, especially in blitz, when I should push my pawn. I don't know how to use, like, my pawns and know when a certain pawn is good to push or not because, like, for example, the f pawn, pushing the f pawn is always weakening to your king if you castle kingside, and it's just like, is this attack going to help or not? I definitely struggle with that. So, okay, let's talk about how to fix all of these topics that I have listed besides like psychology. I will not talk about that. I don't think it's useful. If your weakness is like endgames and you are a beginner, then all you need is Silman's complete endgame course. That's it. It's a very good book. He divides the chapters based on ratings, so like you have beginner to 900, and I don't remember like how he divides the ratings, but it's a really good book and makes a lot of sense, and he's good at explaining the fundamental endgame theory that you need to know. Uh, there's a lot of good endgame books, especially for players who are more advanced. Ruben Fine's book for theoretical reference is okay. I don't really like it because it's just a reference book and kind of uh, just, you don't have to read the whole thing. You can read Endgame Strategy by Mikhail Sharevsky, probably one of the best endgame books actually. It's very short and good read. I think you should read it. It will train both endgame and strategy and can be read in about a week or two. You can read Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, but it's very hard. Also, Nunn's Endgame book is pretty good. And finally, if you want like some training, I guess, then you can probably profit from Encyclopedia of Chess Endgame series. A lot of the examples sometimes are like repetitions, so maybe you can skip some of them sometimes, but they're really good to run through and maybe spar against a computer. Maybe most ideal is to have like a PGN version of this book instead of the book so that you have the solutions with you and you can run it on a program and spar against a computer. Also, like for DVDs, there's Mark Dvoretsky's DVD on Endgames and Karsten Mueller's Endgame DVD course, which is more for like fundamental stuff, which is I haven't actually checked it out. It looks pretty good, I think. Might want to look at that if you are beginner or novice and you want to learn, well, like novice to like intermediate club player and you want to learn something about the fundamentals of endgames. Um, if your weakness is about fundamentals, in a very general sense, and not just like endgames, but like all of fundamentals, then there's only one book that you really have to read, which, if you like reading books, that would be Soviet Chess Primer by Mazelis. Also, Capablanca's Chess Fundamentals is really good, actually, for fundamentals. Well, I mean, these books, okay, they may not be necessary for improving fundamentals, but um, just reading these two books is probably enough, or even just Soviet Chess Primer. It's a really good book. It covers virtually all topics of chess, and he's got some really pretty studies in there, like composed puzzles that are very cute and fun. So it's definitely an enjoyable book. You could also look at like Fiona's Fundamentals. That's by Simon Williams and like his girlfriend, I guess, Fiona, Women International Master. It's a very good book or DVD. I have watched maybe half of it some time ago. And yeah, Simon Williams, I am pretty fond of his content in general. I'll throw one more book out there for an experienced player that's not like expert or master, which is Modern Ideas in Chess by Richard Reddy. For players beyond that who still struggle with fundamentals, like maybe like 2100 rated and they struggle with fundamentals, I think Yusupov's series Build Up Your Chess, Boost Your Chess, Chess Evolution will be your best bet probably. Um, Also, I guess like Silman's book, Amateur's Mind and Reassess Your Chess are good for uh, more of the novice players, by the way, that are suffering fundamentally. A weakness about tactical vision is pretty simple to treat, but I think most people don't treat it the right way. Most players prefer to grind non-stop tactics on a website like Chess Tempo or LeeChess.org tactics. I think grinding tactics is not valuable. Tactics do not, like solving these puzzles do not really have a connection with like the games that you play. And it's also quite curious when you see players solving all these tactics and making lots of blunders in their games still. It just shows that tactics are probably overrated training tool. That's not to say that solving tactical puzzles on chess tempo or whatever is bad. I think it's good training if you do it in moderation. It's probably universally good for a warm-up. Tactics are probably the single most important topic to be pretty good at. If your weakness is tactics, then you definitely have to work on that before anything else. Anyway, I think the best way to improve your tactical vision is to study the games of the attacking players like Morphy, Tal, Alekine. Um, and the second way would be to employ Botvinnik's method of playing tactical and complicated in your own games, your own training games. I'll talk about training games later, but I think Blitz is a great training tool, and I'll explain why later. It's a very controversial and interesting topic. So, I mean, if you are like a beginner, then I don't think you need to read those books, although Morphe is kind of more beginner friendly than Tal or Alekine. I think studying Morphe's games, maybe finding a playlist on YouTube, maybe I'll make one actually, would be very useful. Highly advanced players that are quite strong, like 2200 maybe, should read Chess Informant and Encyclopedia of Chess Problems, as well as Encyclopedia of Chess Miniatures, and best of all for tactical training, Encyclopedia of Chess Combinations. I'll throw in one more book that will be excellent for any player rated under something like 1800 FIDE. Laszlo Polgar's book called Chess. In that book, it's got tons of mate and ones, twos, and threes, and solving these are extremely useful for training tactical vision, especially for beginners, because mate combinations are like the core of chess. Like the core of chess is to checkmate. It's important that you learn all the checkmates and mating techniques. So like that's true for endgames too. For endgames, the first endgame thing you want to study usually is going to be like how to checkmate with a king and queen versus king. I think this is like the first thing that a beginner who knows the notation should learn. If your weakness is attacking, then there is one excellent book called Art of Attack by Vucikovic. There's also an excellent DVD called Attacking Chess by International Master Alex Batty. I have not actually used this, but I heard it's one of the best ones out there, and I think I read something by Alex Batty before, and I liked a lot what he said. It's completely something else, but I think it must have to be good, so you can check that out too. Also, study the games of the great attacking players again, so Tal, Alekine, Morphy. I will throw in another player you can study, Nezmetdinov, Nezmehtdinov. He was Tal's coach and hyper aggressive player, extremely aggressive. And finally, you can again employ Mikhail Botvinnik's technique, play training games that are dedicated to the topic weakness that you're trying to train. So play attacking chess in your own games and see where you make your mistakes that are related to attacking. If your weakness is intuition, then the best treatment is to study a great player's collection of games that were annotated by themselves. This is important. You do not want to read a book that was written by somebody who did not play the games that he or she talks about in the book. Well, I'm not saying these books are bad. For example, Bronstein's book about the 1953 Zurich tournament is one of the best books ever written, probably, for learning strategy and delving into some chess history. But I'm just saying that if you are trying to improve intuition, then you don't need that stuff. You need a book about a chess player who played um, all of the players is like interesting games that are annotated by themselves. This will teach you how to think like that one player and how he decides some of his moves. It's extremely important. Alekhine has written a series of books called My Games of Chess. The time span covers between 1908 and until 1947, if I remember correctly. He showcases all of his games and talks, well, not all of them, but like all of his like favorite games, and he talks about them. Well, okay, for a beginner or club player, his works may be pretty advanced, maybe too advanced, because he does not write a lot. He does not go into much like fundamentals. He's just saying, okay, here's my opinion. This is why I played this move, and just like, here's how I evaluate the position. Um, right, because novices, before they study these advanced things, they should really understand all the conceptual chess fundamentals. Right, so for this, I think Soviet Chess Primer or Capablanca's Chess Fundamentals might be enough to equip yourself to read Alekhine's works. Maybe also My System by Aaron Nimzovich also. Another book is Fisher's 60 Memorable Games. It's also quite advanced, maybe even harder to read than Alekhine's books. But it's also really good book. Bobby Fischer talks about his games, and it's very interesting because Fischer thinks slightly different than what most chess players are um, stereotyped as thinking like. Well, he was an extremely concrete player, more concrete than most other players, which I actually have a theory that maybe that's what contributed to his massive success was how concrete he was. He would play many anti-positional moves just because he calculated that that dynamically speaking and concretely speaking, it just all works out in his favor. A uh, very cold-blooded player. Cold-blooded, just calculative. One last advice is to watch other players play, because you can watch top chess blitz games on chess.com, for example, and you can learn a lot about the structure that they may play. For example, I watched one game with Hikaru Nakamura where he played with an isolated queen's pawn, and his bishops were on e2 and e3, and he played his knight on f3 to d2, and then like later c4, and started trying to create simultaneous threats on both the queen side and the center. So like from this one game alone, I feel like I improved my intuition and how to play isolated queen's pawn positions. Among more novice players, a weakness about calculation can be improved by practicing disciplined calculation in their own games and just really at least trying to calculate. Um, and what will really aid that is developing pattern recognition, something like a pattern repertoire. For training pattern recognition and basic tactics, chess.com's Puzzle Rush is a great tool where you can try to solve as many easy puzzles as you can in a short time. But on chess.com, if you're not a premium member, you can only do it once per day. Matthew Zadler's DVD on Chess24 called Exploring Chess Tactics is really good and covers a lot of fundamentals and really connects it to the actual chess games. Um, for more advanced players, the best way to practice calculation is uh, stuff like solving composed endgame studies that incorporate multiple endgame and tactical motifs. Also, playing blindfolded or solving these same studies blindfolded is really useful. Kubl's endgame studies in particular are very good for training your calculation. Sometimes his solutions are very straightforward and forcing, but it is still really good practice to visualize it all in your head. In fact, probably uh, the most ideal way, because you kind of already maybe know what the solution has to be when you look at a board, but it's very important to see it all and correctly uh, see all the moves and positions in your head. Carlson mentioned that a player can really improve a lot by trying to compose their own studies and solving other people's studies. So, for defense, you should study the games of defensive players like Ulf Andersson, and also solving composed endgame studies and defensive tactics will help. For defensive tactics, Agard's book called Practical Chess Defense is pretty good in terms of the examples he puts. Another important way to practice defense is with the Botvinnik method, practicing defense in your own games. On a further note, you can study the book Grandmaster Chess Strategy. It's a great coverage of Ulf Andersson's chess games. Also, the DVD series called Devastating Defense is excellent, especially for novices. If general strategy is your weakness, well, this is perhaps the most difficult one to train. It is such a broad topic, and many people who can teach stuff like tactics and openings cannot as easily teach strategy. There are many excellent books. Helston's book on mastering chess strategy is really good and easy to read and pretty comprehensive. Also, Gelfand's strategy book, Strategical Play and Dynamic Play, those are two separate books. They're both very good for strategy and very important reads. His book on strategy is better than dynamics because Gelfand himself was an extremely strategic player. For dynamic play, that's more like Bobby Fischer. He's probably the best dynamical player that ever lived. Him and Alekhine, probably the two most dynamic. If your weakness in strategy is more specific, like let's say pawn structures, then Ricardo Flores' book on pawn structures is good. So is Andrew Soltis' pawn book, Pawn Play. Or I don't remember the exact title. But it's Andrew Soltis is a pretty good author in general. I like all his books that I've seen. So maybe that's a good start. Perhaps my favorite strategy book of all time is The Method in Chess by Josef Dorfman, and his sequel called The Critical Moment in Chess. I think these two books are probably the best books that were ever written, just based on my research. Uh, Alexander Grischuk recommended these two books. He's a top Russian player currently, and uh, it's one of those books where, regardless of what your weaknesses and strengths are, it will probably help you improve, uh, help everybody improve, especially if you are uh, intermediate to advanced player. He also has a great DVD series coverage on the method in chess with Jan Gustafsson on Chess 24, and it's also probably one of the best DVDs that exist. I will also throw out that the 21st century edition of My System by Aaron Nimzovich is a great book for strategy, and it's the most classic. It's probably a book that everybody should read at some point. I know that Kramnik was kind of a fan of it. He said that it's kind of too systematic, but it's also very important for finding like candidate moves and stuff, and just learning something about chess history. Um, Funny enough, one of the books I mentioned earlier, Grandmaster Chess Strategy, adamantly claims that players would be improving faster if only they read My System sooner. One other excellent book that uh, maybe is enough on its own without any of these other books even is Bronstein's 1953 Zurich tournament book. It is simply the single-handedly best explained collection of chess games for chess strategy. He explains very well some complicated strategies like how to play on the light squares as a way to control the dark squares and exploit the dark square weaknesses. The book My System by Nimzovich, as well as Dorfman's Method in Chess and Critical Moment in Chess, they're also all connected with the topic of systematic thinking system, which is a legitimate topic that can potentially be a player's biggest weakness as well. The Soviet Chess Primer book also tackles this topic. If your weakness is how to think in chess, then all of these books are extremely helpful. There is one famous book by Kotov called How to Think Like a Grandmaster, or maybe it's just called Think Like a Grandmaster. Kotov in general was a good author and contributed to a good handful of Soviet chess classics, but Think Like a Grandmaster is probably not one of them actually. It's not very practical, and it is bested by the Soviet Chess Primer. I just thought I should mention that. Kotov is a good author, but Think Like a Grandmaster is probably not a great book, especially nowadays. Maybe back then it made a lot more sense. The main problem with it is that it's only useful for like chess where you don't have a time control. He talks about how to thoroughly calculate and analyze ideas in a position, like in a tree of calculation, but it doesn't accurately portray how the modern grandmasters think. Maybe back then it was very accurate, like a lot of players had to be very confident because they can't say that they know what the best move is, right? But now that we have chess engines, we can study the best moves. So maybe it's also a good read, but if your weakness is on how to think in chess, then Nimzovich or Dorfman should be enough. One other potential weakness for a chess player is openings. I wanted to talk about specifically openings last because it may deserve a separate coverage and it is one of the more controversial topics. Some players suggest studying and booking up in the opening, including very strong players. Others say do not study the opening at all until you are a much stronger player. Most lie somewhere in between, like, okay, maybe study an important variation, but not more. Here's my take. So, for beginners and novices and even intermediate players, I think the most important opening related work you can do, besides learning the principles, is probably studying the opening traps. For this, I recommend running through the Encyclopedia of Chess Miniatures. Encyclopedia is by Chess in Format. Um, and I actually mentioned this book earlier when discussing how to treat your tactical vision. Opening traps are extremely important for novices to be well versed in. Why? It's not so that you can play them in your own games. It's not so that you can think like, oh, maybe a trap exists, I better look for a trap in my game. No, that's not why it's important. The reason it's important is so that you know that they exist, which sounds like such a small reason, but it's really important to know that they exist. And this was proven in game between Fischer and Reshevsky, where Fischer just trapped Reshevsky and won in like 9 moves, and Reshevsky's like the best Polish player to ever live and world champion for several years. This was because Fischer knew everything about opening traps. He obsessively studied everything in chess literature and knew things that nobody knew, even like the Soviet players. Very knowledgeable player. So, yes, Encyclopedia of Chess Miniatures is like a large collection of all these traps, and um, it may also build your opening intuition, so that's good. For advanced players around expert, maybe higher too, the best way to study the openings is by skimming the games in the database played by grandmasters and just making general observations about how the middle game plays out from the opening. Most opening books are kind of like fad and um, maybe not the best use of your time because it's just so specific, but great opening books completely exist. Beginners should study only principles and traps, concrete traps. Okay, let's talk about how to identify what your weaknesses may be. Here is a controversial take. Play lots of Blitz online and track your progress. 3 plus 0 minute and 5 plus 0 minute time controls are both good. Not increment because of cheaters and because it's not really necessary. Yeah, so playing Blitz, it's a very two-sided thing that a lot of people find interesting. It's very well known that many of the world's strongest players have strongly advised against Blitz. Uh, Mikhail Botvinnik famously did. Even Bobby Fischer did. A more modern example, like Nigel Short, thinks Blitz rots your brain. Here's the thing, back then these players were playing much longer time controls where analyzing deeply was crucial. So it was important for them to figure out how to think on their own. Now that we have engines, we don't need to think for ourselves as much, although it may still be important. But the most important thing is to build an instant intuition. This is what separates grandmasters from like international master, for example, is they just know intuitively what's the best move, and all they have to do to figure out whether it's best or not is just to calculate, basically, just the very concrete analysis. At some point, you will definitely need experience in longer time controls and maybe even correspondence. But I think Blitz should be the main time control to play with. I have seen with my own eyes many strong players improve a lot just by sparring blitz. I can name at least 6 people maybe. One person improved from 1200 to 2500 in about 3.5 years on Lichess, mostly by sparring blitz. I mean, actually Capablanca loved to train with blitz. It was also his main training tool, as was with Mikhail Tal. Tal and Capablanca played lots of blitz and improved from it. It's quite funny because their styles are almost the opposite. Tal was very practical and aggressive, whereas Capablanca was very theoretical and principled. Carlsen is known to spar lots of blitz, as are many of the other top players. The bottom line is, it's very important to play both blitz and long time controls. Um, Interesting is maybe consider online chess like a video game, like an MMORPG where you have to grind and grind and increase your rating. I think this is one of the most useful training tools. Grind blitz like an MMO, kind of. I mean, that's just like a analogy for people that are video game players. So on chess.com, they have a feature where they can analyze your own game. You can get basic analysis whenever you want, basically, but you can only get full analysis once a day. Their once a day full analysis is actually really useful. For whichever game you analyze, it will look through, do all the usual stuff, but the cool thing is it actually recommends what you need to do, what you need to work on, and what your weaknesses are. I think this is an extremely useful tool to use. It will give you a list of themes and topics and tell you what you did the worst in. Of course, chess.com's tool is not really necessary. I think in order to identify your weaknesses, you just have to look at your games on a regular basis and then you will sort of be able to tell. The stronger you get, the more good of an idea probably it is to have a coach help analyze for you and tell you what your weaknesses are. I am planning a continuous practice of analyzing games for people where viewers of this YouTube channel can basically send me their games and I can talk about them. And just a continuous practice of trying to diagnose their weaknesses. Another way to possibly diagnose your weakness, there's another interesting way, is you can use Igor Khmelnytsky's book called Chess Exam and Training Guide. I guess it is interesting. He divides chess into like a bunch of categories like threats, calculation, middle game, end game, strategy, openings, standard positions. He tests you in a lot of positions and asks you to find the best move and evaluate, and then he rates you on each category and overall and tells you what he thinks you need to work on. With all of this in mind, I will say that for the most effective training method, it makes the most sense to kill as many birds with one stone as you can. Notice how some of these topics can really connect with one another for sometimes. For example, Dorfman's book is useful for both strategy and learning how to approach the whole chess game with a thinking system. It is these kind of books that will be the most useful in general, where they cover multiple topics. To recap and finish, here is the general training method I suggest. Warm up with tactical puzzles firsthand. For chess.com, the daily 5 tactics and puzzle rush is probably enough. And just spar lots of blitz and 3+0 time control. Blitz, not bullet, not rapid, classical, but blitz. Track your rating progress and identify recurring weaknesses in your chess understanding. If you are rated maybe between 1600 and 2400 on chess.com Blitz, and your weaknesses related to intuition, attacking, or tactics, like those categories specifically, also strategy, then the best way to kill as many birds as you can with one stone is to read Alekine's Best Game of Chess series. His books about his games will teach you all of those things, and it is simply just excellent. Maybe for attack, tactics, and intuition, it is actually already enough. It's already enough just to read those books and try to study and look at variations. Especially if your weakness isn't something in like specific in particular, then this was really good. Probably one of the best chess series, if not the best chess series ever written. Alekine's Best Games of Chess. That's how, um, like, I just think it's really good. If your weakness is like highly specific, then you can just find books or videos that specifically tackle whatever that specific weakness is. If such weaknesses can usually be improved upon in a short time, or excuse me, those kind of specific weaknesses can usually be improved upon in a very short time. If your weakness is about strategy or thinking, like both of those are things you're weak on, then Dorfman's books are the way to go. For stuff like endgames, you should probably let that topic be its own thing, like especially as a novice, and you can just read, well, okay, like the fundamentals will cover that stuff for the beginners. So let's say for the intermediate players, you want Silman's Complete Endgame Course. Excellent book. If you want to combine like training intuition with endgames because you think both of those things are your weakness, then maybe you can read Capablanca's Chess Endgames book. It's a very important topic studying. Endgame is a very important topic. Studying them will improve your middle games, not just your end games. Solving like creative studies is almost always a useful way to train, regardless of what your weaknesses will be, because it trains a wide variety of topics: calculation, tactical vision, endgames, and sometimes defense if it's like a study where you have to play for a draw in an otherwise lost position, or something like that. It will also teach you to be more precise and not to play like an average move. One of the problems that many intermediate, like maybe 1800 rated players have is that they often just play the most average move, and they need to be more ambitious and try to find the best moves. Kubel has a lot of studies that are like useful for training defense. He's got a lot of draw studies where you have to like find a stalemate kind of a thing. Okay, well, that's a lot already. And just to end here, I should just say there may be some training methods that I did not talk about, and I'm sure I also left out many good books or resources. For example, sparring against the chess engines like Ribka or Houdini is something I did not talk about. Also, Leela Chess Zero is interesting to spar. This kind of thing may be pretty useful from time to time. I think it makes sense sometimes, like if you're training calculation, then it makes a lot of sense to spar blindfolded against a computer. By the way, Play Magnus is a great computer to play with. It's a more human computer, and you can progressively level up. And you can also learn some interesting opening theory, and there's no shame. It's not based on rating or anything like that. You're just playing against the computer. Um, okay, well, you do not have to train like with any hard rules or hard program. There's many players much stronger than me that may disagree with some or many of the things I said. Um, some things work for certain people that don't work for other people. For example, like for really old people that, well, I don't want to sound offensive, just like, uh, lack of a better word, older folks that do not really have the reaction time to play Blitz. Maybe Blitz will not really be useful for them. Um, Blitz will be more useful for kids who have the energy to do it. So there's really no hard rule for how to study. The main takeaway is just understand what your weaknesses are and try to turn it into a strength. Try to fix that weakness. I mean, okay, you can read several books of different topics, or you can focus one book at a time. It's probably better to, in general, to focus on one book at a time. It's better to focus solely on this weakness. But yeah, about the Blitz thing, it's pretty controversial, polarized topic. One side is very large and stands in firm affirmation that Blitz rots your brain, and will not help. However, there is another side that is growing and firmly asserting that it is actually one of the best training tools out there. I personally stand by the latter side. From my own personal experience, I have seen Blitz be an extremely useful tool as a matter of fact, and also real games just slowly continue to be faster in real life. Magnus Carlsen has proven that you can have an idea of what the best move may be in a very short amount of time, kind of like Capablanca. Carlsen is a lot like Capablanca. He is a little bit lazy on the openings, although probably not as much as Capablanca was. He's an endgame virtuoso, the best endgame player that ever lived, probably, and just very like principled player in general. He's also kind of like maybe I'm not sure who are some other good old players to compare him with. Well, Carlsen's play is a lot based around practical ability, especially in the end games, kind of like Capablanca. So I guess he's the Capablanca's the best comparison to Magnus Carlsen. Um, okay, anyway, he shows that you can have an idea of what the best move is, and all that it takes to find the best move is to calculate it. So in a way, you don't really have to think in chess sometimes. You can just simply know without understanding why you know that a certain idea is good. And Blitz is good for that kind of thing. It's pretty good. So anyway, these are just some of my reasons as to why I think Blitz is underappreciated and can definitely help improve one's game and figure out what they need to study. I hope this all helps. Take care and enjoy. I'll be posting more content soon. Spar Blitz and use that to figure out what your weaknesses are and track your rating, and then just fix your weaknesses. And if your rating improves, then good. Find a new weakness to improve. That should be general idea. Thanks and bye. Hopefully this helps.